The wolf appeared at the ranger station door at 4:47 in the morning and did not move for 11 minutes. Cade Morrow knew this because the motion sensor log on the exterior camera recorded the exact times, and later, when people asked him to describe what happened, that was always where he started. Not with the sound the wolf made. Not with the way the animal stood so still against the dark that the camera almost failed to resolve its shape. He started with the time stomp, because the time stomp was something he could say out loud without his voice changing. 4:47. 11 minutes, and then, on the 12th minute, the wolf turned and walked in a slow and deliberate line into the tree line, and stopped and looked back. Cade had been awake when it happened. That was the first thing that struck him as strange. Later, when he had the space to reconstruct the night in order, he was almost never awake at 4:47 in the morning. The outpost at Bear Creek had no cell signal and poor radio reception and a heating system that required manual attention twice a night during the first hard freeze. And so Cade slept in 2-hour blocks from October through March. And even then, the cold usually kept him unconscious between the alarms. But that night, he had been sitting at the small table near the window with a mug of coffee he had stopped drinking, looking at nothing in particular, when the motion sensor light clicked on and the outdoor camera feed lit up the monitor on his desk. He told himself later that he would have gotten up regardless. He told himself that a large predator at the station door at that hour was a safety concern and protocol required him to document it and assess whether the animal posed a risk to any personnel, even though at Bear Creek, the only personnel was Cade himself, and the nearest other human being was the survey team camping 17 miles east, and they would have been long asleep. He told himself all of that, and he almost believed it. But the truth was that the moment he saw the wolf on the monitor, he felt something shift inside his chest that he hadn't felt in 4 years. And he stood up before he had consciously decided to. The wolf's eyes, caught in the motion sensor's infrared wash, were pale, almost white, the kind of pale that in certain lights made it impossible to tell where the iris ended and the pupil began. He had seen that color of eye before, not in a wolf, on a dog. He told himself it didn't mean anything. He pulled on his insulated jacket and his radio and his headlamp, and he unbolted the station door, and the cold hit him like walking into a wall. The wolf was in the tree line 30 feet from the door. It hadn't gone anywhere. What happened in the next 6 hours would be investigated by the Park Service, documented by a wildlife biologist from the state university, discussed by a search and rescue coordinator in a presentation she gave 4 times, 2 different professional organizations. And still, at the end of all that documentation and discussion and analysis, nobody could fully account for how it happened. The wolf behaved in ways that wolves, as anyone who studies them will tell you, are not supposed to behave. The timing of what it did defied any rational reconstruction of cause and effect. And 12 hours after Cade Morrow followed that animal through the dark into the mountain, the slope above the cave, called Hollow Point, released 300,000 cubic feet of snow and ice and rock, and buried everything on that trail. Under 20 feet of debris, everything except what had already been removed. This is how it happened. Cade had been stationed at Bear Creek Outpost for 3 winters. Before that, he had been at the Mineral Basin post closer to the highway where the tourists went. And before that, he had spent 4 years working trail maintenance out of the main ranger station in the valley. He had requested the Bear Creek posting himself. He had not explained why to his supervisor, Deb, who had looked at him for a long time before approving the transfer, and had said only that she expected him to check in on the radio every morning by 8, regardless of conditions, and that if he missed 2 consecutive check-ins, she would send someone up. He had agreed to this. He had understood that it was the best deal he was going to get. Bear Creek was 40 miles from the nearest town and accessible by a service road that became impassable after the first significant snow of the season, which in recent years had arrived somewhere between late October and mid-November. After that first snow, Cade was on foot, and the snowmobile, and the radio, and his own company until the spring thaw cleared the road sometime in April. He had provisions for 6 months. He had a medical kit certified for wilderness emergency response. He had a shelf of books he read each winter and then placed back on the shelf in the same order. Not because he was obsessive about order, but because it gave him a sense of continuous time, of a year having passed and another starting, that he had trouble locating elsewhere. The books had belonged to his brother. His brother's name was Fallon, and he had died at Twinyade in an avalanche on the backside of Crow Peak, 4 miles from the base camp where Cade had been waiting with a radio he was trying and failing to reach him on. Fallon had been an amateur climber, not a professional. He had been careful, in the way that careful means when you love something enough to keep doing it, despite the ways it frightens the people who love you. He had gone up on a clear morning in February and had not come down. They found him 9 days later, after the snow shifted. By then there was nothing Cade could do except stand in the field behind his parents' house at 3 in the morning and tell himself things he could not bring himself to believe. This was not unusual. People who work in wilderness environments and lose someone to the wilderness sometimes do not leave. It is not always because they are unable to process the grief, though sometimes it is that too. Sometimes it is because staying near the place where it happened is the only way they know how to keep the person in the present tense. To say he died here, in Ranger among these peaks, under this sky, and to stand under that same sky, is a form of continuing that conversation that cannot be conducted anywhere else. Cade had never said this out loud to anyone. Not to them. Not to his parents, who called every Sunday and had stopped asking when he was coming down not on uni. He carried it with him into the tree line that morning at 4:47, behind a wolf he could not explain, into the dark. The wolf moved in a straight line northwest, toward the upper drainage where Bear Creek narrowed between the canyon walls and the forest thinned into exposed rock and Cade knew that terrain well. He patrolled it twice a week in summer and once a week in early fall, checking for fallen trees across the trail, monitoring the creek levels, documenting wildlife activity. He knew where the trail switch backed up the canyon face and where it crossed the creek on the wooden footbridge that was anchored with steel cables because the winter snowmelt had taken out 2 previous versions in a decade. He also knew the cave. Hollow Point was what the old survey maps called it, and most of the park staff used that name, though it did not appear on any of the public trail maps. It was a natural shelter in the canyon wall, 30 feet deep and 15 feet wide at the mouth, narrowing toward the back where the rock had been laid down in horizontal strata and had shifted over time into a curved interior that caught sound in an unusual way. In summer, hikers sometimes sheltered there in sudden storms. In winter, it was above the safe hiking elevation for most visitors, and the trail leading to it was unpatrolled after the first hard snow. What the wolf was doing in this canyon, at this hour, moving in this direction with this consistency, was a question that Cade had begun to form somewhere in the back of his mind but had not yet brought to the front. The front was occupied with footing and headlamp angle and the simple logistics of moving through dark terrain that had been iced over in the night. The back of his mind was doing something else, something he would not examine until later. And what it was doing was cataloging. The wolf had not taken the most direct route through the forest. It had taken the trail. Not approximately the trail, not a parallel line through the trees that happened to shadow the cut path, but the actual trail, the marked and maintained route with its switchbacks and its worn tread and its signage, that the wolf was of course not reading, and did not need to read. It had taken the path that a person would take. There was an explanation for this. Trails through dense forest follow the path of least resistance, and predators tend to move along the same natural corridors that human trail builders tend to identify. He knew this. It was not magic. But the wolf was also staying at 20 feet, not 19. Not 30, 20. The way a person might maintain a distance from a stranger they wanted to guide without alarming. He had stopped twice on the trail, once to adjust his headlamp, and once because a section of the path was glazed with ice, and he needed to slow his pace to navigate it safely. Both times, the wolf had slowed. Both times, when he resumed normal pace, the wolf had resumed normal pace. He had told himself it was coincidence the first time. The second time he had told himself it again, and the telling had been less convincing. Cade had been working in wilderness environments for 15 years. He had had encounters with bears, mountain lions, moose, and, twice, with wolves, and in none of those encounters had the animal behaved in a way that required a vocabulary other than the vocabulary of wildlife encounter protocols. They had moved as wildlife moves, with their own logic, toward their own purposes, in patterns that occasionally intersected with human presence, but which were in no meaningful sense oriented toward it. This was different. He could not say exactly how, and he could not say it in language that would sound credible to another person, but it was different. And some part of him that had been working in wilderness for 15 years was reading that difference, whether he had decided to read it or not. He followed the wolf. By the time the canyon walls rose on either side and the trail steepened toward Hollow Point, his headlamp had been burning for 40 minutes, and the sky above, the canyon rim, had shifted from black to the deep blue that comes just before first light. He could hear the creek to his left, moving under its thin shelf of early ice. And above him the rock face was dark and without feature except where the snow had packed into the crevices and showed white. 7 years ago, before any of it, before the grief had become something he wore instead of something that happened to him, they had eaten sandwiches on the ledge outside the cave mouth and watched the sun go down over the ridge. And Fallon had said something about how the rock formations looked like a cathedral to him. All that height and stillness, and Cade had said he thought that was probably the altitude talking, and Fallon had laughed. And that laugh was one of the things Cade still kept somewhere he could reach it. He was thinking about none of this as he followed the wolf through the dark. He was concentrating on his footing and on the animal ahead of him, which moved in a way that registered somewhere at the back of his awareness as unusual. Wolves, in his experience, did not pace themselves to human movement. They did not wait. They did not adjust their trajectory based on whether the animal behind them was keeping up. But this one kept a distance of approximately 20 feet between them, and when Cade slowed to navigate a section of iced-over trail, the wolf slowed, and when Cade's headlamp beam shortened at a section of dense spruce where the canopy cut the beam's reach, the wolf moved closer to the edge of the light's range and turned, briefly, before continuing. He noticed it. He told himself it was coincidence. By the time the canyon walls rose on either side and the trail steepened toward Hollow Point, his headlamp had been burning for 40 minutes, and the sky above, the canyon rim, had shifted from black to the deep blue that comes just before first light. He could hear the creek to his left, moving under its thin shelf of early ice, and above him the rock face was dark and without feature except where the snow had packed into the crevices and showed white. The wolf stopped. It was 60 feet from the cave mouth. It had stopped in the middle of the trail, and it was standing absolutely still. Its nose pointed forward, its posture different from how it had moved in the trees. Something in the set of its shoulders was different. Cade stopped, too. He listened. Wind in the canyon. The creek, his own breath, which was loud in the cold. And then, from somewhere inside the rock, something else. He stood there for 4 seconds before his mind put a word to it. A child's voice. There are moments that later become before and after. Not because the moment itself is dramatic, necessarily, but because the understanding that arrives with it is so large that the mind has to reorganize everything into what was known before this and what is known now. Cade would describe this later as the sensation of a room changing size, which was not quite right, but was the closest he could get. He moved forward at a run. The wolf did not follow him. It stayed where it was on the trail, and the last time Cade looked back before he reached the cave mouth, it was still standing in the dark, watching him, its pale eyes catching the beam of his headlamp with a reflection that was almost colorless. The cave mouth was obscured. He almost missed it entirely, and would have, if not for the thread of orange light coming from a point low in the rock face, no larger than a coin. Someone had a flashlight, or a phone, and it had been burning long enough that the battery was nearly gone. He pressed himself against the rock at the cave mouth and called out, and the child's voice stopped. And there was a silence that felt like a held breath. And then a woman's voice came from deeper in the cave, ragged with cold and fear and something underneath both of those things that was pure relief. She said there were 4 of them. Her name was Petra, and her name doesn't appear here because it was her name in the police report that was filed the following week, but because of the way she said it later, when she was describing the moment she heard a human voice in the cave mouth, how she had whispered her own name as a way of anchoring herself, as if to say, I am still here. I still have a name. I am not yet a story that ends inside a mountain. She had a husband, Boone, who was hypothermic, and no longer speaking in complete sentences. She had a 7-year-old daughter named Rue. She had a 4-year-old son whose name was Stellan, and whose voice was the one Cade had heard through 30 feet of rock from the trail outside. They had been in the cave for 19 hours. What had happened to bring them there was, on the surface, a story that Cade had heard in different variations many times in his career. A family on an off-drill route during the first significant storm of the season. A map that predated the most recent trail closures. A husband who was experienced enough to be overconfident and not experienced enough to know the difference. A storm that arrived 6 hours earlier than the forecast had indicated. The trail down had become impassable in a matter of hours. And Boone had known about Hollow Point from an old hiking forum post he had read and never quite forgotten, and he had navigated to it mostly by instinct and partly by the single functional bar of GPS signal. He had managed to get on his phone before the battery died. They had made it. That was the not small thing. They had made it to the cave, and they were alive. But Boone had fallen on the last section of trail and had hit the canyon wall with his left side and had cracked 2 ribs, which would not have been immediately critical except that the pain made it difficult to move, and the cold made everything worse. And by the time Cade entered the cave with his pack and his emergency blankets and his hot water thermos and his radio, Boone's lips were gray and his hands were not responding the way hands should respond, and his body temperature was at a margin that required attention. Cade worked for 3 hours. He would not have described what he did in those 3 hours as remarkable. He would have said that he did what the training required, which was true, and that the training was thorough, which was also true, and that he was calm, which he was, but not in the way the word calm usually implies. It was the stillness of someone who has nothing else available to be. He could not afford panic, and he could not afford grief, and he could not afford the luxury of thinking about what any of this meant. And so he was simply present, in the cave, with 4 people who needed him to keep their bodies warm, and to contact search and rescue on the radio, and to keep the 7-year-old girl occupied so she did not cry in a way that would further terrify her 4-year-old brother. Rue sat beside him the whole time. She did not help. Exactly. But she was present in the way that children sometimes are, very still and very watchful, absorbing everything and saying almost nothing. And at one point she reached out and put her hand on Cade's arm while he was working, and he registered the weight of it, but could not stop to acknowledge it. He heated water on the emergency stove he kept in his pack, the compact one the size of a paperback, and he pressed a cup into Boone's hands and watched to see if the man's fingers would close around it the way they needed to. They did, slowly, and the grip was loose, but it was there, and Cade let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Rue stayed at his elbow through all of it. He had learned her name within the first 10 minutes, because Petra had said it repeatedly in the way that parents say a child's name when they are frightened and need the child to be visible and audible and accounted for at every moment. Rue had accepted this accounting with a patience that struck Cade as remarkable in the patience of a child who has been in a long and frightening night and has decided to be whatever her family needs her to be until it is over. At one point, while Cade was working, she asked him in a voice just above a whisper if the wolf had sent him. He did not know how to answer that. He said he had seen an animal on the trail that had led him in the right direction, and he said it in the careful way you say things to children, when the full version is too complicated and the simplified version is not quite a lie. She nodded as if she had expected exactly that answer. He wanted to ask her what she meant by sent. He wanted to know what she had understood, in a 7-year-old's vocabulary, about the thing that had happened. But Petra made a sound from the far wall, and Cade's attention went to Boone, and the question stayed where it was. Unanswered, which he was beginning to understand was the appropriate place for it. There was a point, somewhere around 5 in the morning, when Boone's core temperature had stabilized, enough that the most acute risk had passed and Cade could allow himself to become aware of the rest of his body, which was cold, and which ached from the way he had been crouched against the cave floor. He sat back on his heels and pressed his hands to his knees and looked at the 4 people in front of him. Petra, who was watching him with a specific expression of a person who has been in the presence of catastrophe and has come out the other side and is still in the process of understanding that the other side is real. Boone, whose breathing had steadied into something less labored and whose lips had moved back from gray towards something approaching color. Rue, who was asleep now against Petra's side, her breath slow and even, her face entirely untroubled in the way that children's faces sometimes are in sleep, as if the body knows it can let go now. And Stellan, the 4-year-old, who had fallen asleep on the emergency blanket, with one fist pressed to his cheek and the other wrapped around the edge of his mother's jacket. Cade had not thought about the thing he was looking at while he was looking at it. He had been working. But now, in the interval between the crisis and the rescue, he became aware of it. A family, whole, breathing, in a cave in the middle of a mountain. Alive. He had not let himself look at that kind of thing in 4 years. He had looked at Fallon's things. His books, his gear, the jacket that still hung in their parents' hallway because nobody had been able to decide what to do with it. He had looked at photographs. He had stood in the field behind the house at 3 a.m. and told himself things that did not hold, but he had not let himself look at the intact version. The version where the family comes out, where the 4 people breathe in the same cave, and the youngest one sleeps with his fist against his cheek. Because there had been no intact version. Not for him. Not for his parents. Not for the people who had stood at the base of Crow Peak on the 9th day and watched what the snow gave back. He pressed his hands harder to his knees. He looked at the cave ceiling for a moment, at the curved rock strata that had been laid down in horizontal bands across millions of years, and that now formed the inside of a shelter that had kept 4 people alive, through a night that should have gone differently. Then he pulled out the radio. The radio made contact with the Valley Station at 6:22 in the morning. The search and rescue team was airborne by 7:40. They landed on the plateau above the canyon at 8:15 and came down the rope. Access route with a litter and medical equipment, and for additional warm bodies, and all of it was exactly as it was supposed to be, efficient and organized and precisely what the training prepared for. And Cade stood at the canyon rim and watched them load Boone into the litter, and watched Petra hold both of her children against her chest with a grip that had something beyond the physical in it. Something that looked like a woman relearning that the world contains good things. And he thought about Fallon for the first time since he had entered the cave. He was not ready for the thought. It arrived anyway. The way those thoughts tend to do. He turned back to the trail, and that was when he saw that the wolf was gone. The search and rescue coordinator was a woman named Dagger, and she was the one who first noted the timing problem in her written report. Cade had found the family at approximately 5:40 a.m. The helicopter had departed with all 4 of them at 9:12. They had taken the service road down to the Valley Hospital by 9:50, and Boone was in surgery for the rib fragments by 11. The Avalanche released at 9:17 p.m. Not 9:17 a.m. 9:17 in the evening, 12 hours and 5 minutes after the last person left the canyon. Dagger had been told about the wolf before she wrote her report, because Cade had included it in his own incident report as a matter of protocol, having documented the motion sensor, timestamps, and the camera footage, and because he was constitutionally unable to lie about what had happened even when lying would have been significantly more comfortable. He had described the wolf's behavior in the flat and measured language of official documentation and had included the phrase, behavior inconsistent with typical wolf-human avoidance patterns, and had left it at that. Dagger had noted this in her report, and had also noted that the timing between the family's extraction and the Avalanche event left no survival margin. The snow released at a point on the slope above the Hollow Point Trail that would have blocked the canyon entrance entirely. She noted that any person in the cave at the time of the release would not have survived. She noted that the window between the family's exit and the event was effectively 0, in the sense that any delay of any length in Cade's response that morning would have shifted the outcome entirely. She presented these findings 4 times. At a search and rescue conference in Denver, at a wildlife management seminar in Bozeman, at a training session for wilderness emergency medical technicians in Salt Lake City, at a small community event in the valley town closest to Bear Creek, where she had been asked to speak by a member of the local wilderness committee, and where Petra and Boone and Drew and Stellan were in the audience. At each presentation, she showed the camera footage of the wolf at the station door. 11 minutes of stillness, 10 to turn, then the tree line, At each presentation, she said that she had consulted with 2 wildlife biologists and a behavioral ecologist, and none of them had been able to fully account for the behavior she documented. She said that wolves are responsive to including subsonic vibrations generated by pre-avalanche snow stress, and that there was a reasonable hypothesis that the animal had perceived the instability on the slope before any instrumentation registered it. She said the word reasonable carefully, with the weight of a person who knows that a word can carry more than its dictionary definition. And then she said that the gap between what could be reasonably explained and what actually happened was still a gap, and that she was not in the habit of filling gaps with language that did not earn its place. And so she would leave the gap there, visible, for whoever was listening. At the event in the valley, when she finished, a small girl raised her hand. Rue, who was 8 by then, who had kept her hand on Cade's arm in the cave that morning, who had been present in the way children sometimes are when they are absorbing something they will carry for decades. She asked if anyone had found the wolf again. "They got a seeth." No. Rue considered this for a moment, in the deliberate way she had, and then she sat back down. "And that was all," she said. And Cade, who was sitting at the back of the room because Dagger had told him he should come and he had not been able to think of a reason not to, watched her sit down and felt the room change size again. The wildlife biologist who had been consulted, a man named Harlan who ran a long-term carnivore study in the Central Rockies, drove up to Bear Creek 3 weeks after the event. He had seen the camera footage and had asked Dagger for permission to review Cade's full motion sensor data and to conduct a track survey in the area where the wolf had been observed. He found tracks, not many and not fresh, but enough. He estimated the animal was a large male, between 90 and 110 pounds, traveling alone, which was unusual for the season. He found no evidence of a pack. He found no kill sites in the immediate area. He documented everything with the thoroughness that his profession required. He also found something in his own database that he had not been looking for. 6 years prior, his team had tagged a male wolf in the northern section of the range. They had called him M41, which is what you call them in the database, because giving them names is a thing that makes it harder to do the work. M41 had been tracked for 2 years, and then the collar signal had gone dark, which happens when batteries fail or when the collar is shed, but which sometimes means other things. When the collar signal went dark, Harlan had written a note in M41's file and moved on. M41 had been described in the tag documentation as a large male, pale gray with almost white eyes, traveling in patterns that deviated from typical pack behavior. He had been documented moving into terrain above typical wolf range multiple times, behavior that had not been fully explained. Harlan showed the camera footage to 2 colleagues. He showed them the still image where the wolf's eyes caught the motion sensor light and showed pale, almost white. He told them he was not saying it was M41. He was saying the physical description was consistent. He was saying the behavior was consistent. He was saying that there were 6 years between the collar going dark and this footage, and that a wolf can live 9 or 10 years in the wild under good conditions, and that the territory M41 had ranged during his tagged years overlapped with the Bear Creek drainage. It was saying without saying it, that sometimes the file you thought was closed is not closed. He wrote up his notes and sent them to Dagger and to Cade and to the University Library Archive, because that is what you do with field notes. And then he drove back down the mountain the way he had come, and the road was clear that day. And the sky above the canyon rim was the specific blue that the sky gets in that range in late November, hard and clear and very far away. Cade stayed at Bear Creek through the winter. He had not planned to do otherwise. The road was closed. The provisions were stocked. The radio check-ins continued at 8 in the morning. He shoveled the access path between the station and the equipment shed. He read the books from the shelf in order, but something had shifted, not in the landscape, which remained exactly as it had been, which was both its severity and the whole point of it. Something had shifted in the way he occupied the landscape, which is a different thing entirely. He walked the canyon trail twice a week, the way he always had, and on the first walk after the snow cleared enough to allow it, he stood at the mouth of Hollow Point and looked at the slope above the canyon, where the avalanche debris had settled into a new topography, a white mass that had changed the profile of the ridge in a way visible from the trail. He stood there for a while, He did not go in. He went in on the second walk. The cave was empty, which he had known it would be, and cold, and the emergency blankets he had left there had been removed by the search and rescue team along with everything else. So it was just the rock and the flat floor and the curved interior that caught sound in its unusual way. That made even his breathing audible. That made the cave feel inhabited even when no one was there. He sat in the back of the cave for a long time. He was not sure what he was doing there. He told himself he was conducting a structural assessment, because the avalanche debris had altered the snow load on the slope above, and it was reasonable to document any changes to the cave entrance or the rock formation. This was true enough that he believed it while he was telling himself, and not quite true enough that he believed it after he stopped. What he was doing was sitting in a place where 4 people had survived the night because something had happened that he could not explain, and trying to understand what that meant for the parallel universe in which no one had survived, in which he had been asleep at 4:47 in the morning the way he was almost always asleep at 4:47 in the morning, in which no motion sensor had lit up any monitor, in which there was nothing out there in the dark to follow. He had been living in that parallel universe for 4 years. Thinthe Falun, the version of the world in which the timing was slightly different, in which the slope released an hour earlier, in which his brother had come down from the mountain the way he always had before. Cade had carried that universe inside the real one, pressing against it from the inside, and it had been exhausting in a way he had never found words for. He was not going to pretend that one wolf and one night had closed that space entirely. That would not have been honest, and he was constitutionally unable to be dishonest about the large things even when honesty was the harder option. But sitting in the back of the cave, he noticed that the parallel universe was, for the first time in 4 years, quiet. Not gone. Just quiet. He did not see the wolf again that winter. He watched for it. Not obsessively, but consistently. The way you watch for something you have stopped expecting and have not entirely stopped hoping for. The motion sensor logs were clean. The track surveys he conducted showed coyote and deer and, once, a mountain lion moving through the drainage below the station, but nothing that matched the size and gait he had recorded on that night in November. He mentioned this to Harlan in an email, one of 3 long emails they exchanged over the course of the winter. The kind of correspondence that happens when 2 people who work alone in remote places find that they are thinking about the same question from different angles. Harlan wrote back that absence of evidence was not evidence of absence, which was the biologist's version of leaving the gap visible. In February, the anniversary of Fallon's death passed the way it did each year, which was badly. And then it passed. The way it did each year, which was eventually, in March, a late storm came through and lasted 4 days, and deposited 18 inches of new snow on top of the existing snowpack. And on the 5th morning, Cade went out to clear the access path and found, in the snow beside the station door, a set of tracks, a gait pattern consistent with a single large canid traveling at a walk. They came from the tree line and stopped 6 feet from the door and then returned to the tree line in the same line they had arrived. He photographed them. He sent the photographs to Harlan. He included no commentary because there was nothing to say that the photographs did not already say. Harlan wrote back 1 word. He said, "Still," as in still here, as in still arriving at the station door in the dark, and standing in the cold, and then returning to the tree line the way it had come, as in the story was not finished, whatever the story was, whatever it meant to have a story that you couldn't fully tell, because the key figure in it existed outside the vocabulary available to you. Cade printed the email and put it on the shelf with the books. It was, in its own way, a record. Spring came in April, as it did, and the road cleared, and the first vehicle up the mountain was Deb's truck, which was the protocol she had maintained for each of his 3 winters. Driving up herself on the first clear day as a check-in, that was also something else. Something she didn't name, and Cade had learned not to name for her. She came in and had coffee and asked how the winter had gone, and he told her. The same way he had told people all winter, but in a way that was easier with Deb, who had known him long enough to let the spaces between the sentences hold their own weight. She asked if he was coming down for the summer or staying up. He said he was going to stay through the summer. She looked at him, not in a worried way, in the way that people who have been paying attention look at you when they notice that something has changed. She said, "All right." She finished her coffee and she drove back down the mountain, and Cade stood on the station steps and watched the truck until it disappeared around the second switchback. And then he was alone again, which had always been true, but was true in a different way now, a way that did not feel identical to loneliness. He walked out to the tree line where the spring snow had softened into something granular and loose, and he looked at the ground. The tracks from February had been buried by the March storm and covered again by the April melt, and were long gone. That was expected. Snow does not hold its records the way rock does. But at the base of the largest spruce, at the edge of the tree line, where the root system had kept the ground partially bare even through the winter, there was a depression in the soil that was not quite the shape of a footprint, but was the size of one, four-toed, approximately the diameter of a spread hand. It might have been anything. The root structure of that tree had been creating divots in the soil for decades. He knew that he had patrolled this stretch of tree line for 3 winters. He had not noticed that particular depression before. He stood over it for a long moment. The sky above the canyon rim was the blue that comes with the first warm days, softer than the winter blue, less absolute. A Clark's nutcracker called from somewhere in the spruces, the dry, percussive note that sounds like something between a question and an answer. Cade looked at the depression in the soil. Then he turned and walked back toward the station. Not quickly, not slowly, moving through the spring morning the way a man moves when he is not running from anything and is not yet sure where he is going, but has recently been given a reason to believe that the direction matters. The nutcracker called again. The snow on the upper slope where the avalanche had been was gone now, melted back into the rock, and the canyon looked as it always had, as if nothing had happened there, as if the mountain had swallowed the whole winter and given back only the spring. But the cave was still there, and Rue would grow up knowing that the darkness inside a mountain had held her once and given her back. And Boone would carry 2 ribs that had been cracked and healed with a ridge of new bone. And Petra would tell the story every year at Thanksgiving because she believed that the stories you tell at Gratitude's table should cost something to tell. And Harlan would keep the file on M41 open on his desk in a way that was unusual for a file 6 years cold. And somewhere in the spruce forest above the canyon, moving in patterns that overlapped with no pack territory and followed no seasonal migration that anyone had mapped, something with pale eyes and a weight on the snow of 90 to 110 pounds continued to move through the range, seen and not seen, tracked and not tracked, its presence documented in a motion sensor log, and in a set of photographs, and in a single-word email, and in a depression in the spring soil that might have been anything. Might have been. Still there. The kind of evidence that science documents in science cannot close, because some things leave a mark that outlasts the explanation. And some arrivals announce themselves in the dark at 4:47 in the morning, and stand there for 11 minutes, and then turn toward the tree line, and look back, and wait.